The Galactic Institute of Interspecies Relations had, over the course of 300 standard cycles, developed what it considered a foolproof system for evaluating the physical capabilities of newly integrated species. This system was born from necessity after the unfortunate incident involving a Quilnarian exchange student who had accidentally crushed a diplomatic envoy's hand during what was meant to be a friendly greeting. The bureaucracy that followed that particular mishap had spawned 17 committees, 42 subcommittees, and enough paperwork to deforest a small moon. Naturally, the Institute's solution was more paperwork, but this time with strength tests attached. The evaluation protocols were designed with mathematical precision and cultural sensitivity, two qualities that rarely cooperated in the same sentence. Every species had their benchmarks, their expected ranges, their carefully calculated limitations. The Thoraxians, with their crystalline endoskeletons, could lift approximately 3 times their body weight. The Klendathi, who evolved in crushing gravity wells, managed an impressive 8 times. Even the diminutive Pixari, who looked like someone had crossbred a rabbit with a soap bubble, could manage twice their mass thanks to their peculiar muscular density. The system worked beautifully, efficiently categorizing species into neat little boxes labeled with maximum load capacities and recommended safety protocols. Then, humanity submitted their application for membership, and the Institute's actuarial department began having what could only be described as mathematical anxiety attacks. The problem with humans, the Institute's senior physical assessment coordinator would later write in his resignation letter, was that they didn't make sense. Their home world boasted a gravity coefficient of 1.0 standard units, which was thoroughly unremarkable. Their musculature appeared adequate but unimpressive under spectral analysis. Their skeletal structure seemed fragile compared to species half their size. By every measurable metric, humans should have been categorized somewhere between the Yulani flower tenders and the Preservian scholars, species renowned for their physical delicacy and their tendency to require assistance opening particularly stubborn containers. The preliminary reports had been filed with confidence. Humans would be classified as Category 4 minimal physical capability, with appropriate workplace accommodations and strength assist technology mandated for any task involving more than 15 standard weight units. The paperwork was already printed. The accommodations were already being installed. Everything was proceeding according to protocol. Nobody had bothered to ask the humans what they thought about these classifications. This would prove to be an oversight of magnificent proportions. The physical evaluation course was held in Training Complex Gamma 7, a facility that had been designed to accommodate species ranging from the practically microscopic to the genuinely enormous. The ceiling soared 30 meters overhead. The walls were reinforced with pressure-resistant polymers, and the equipment had been tested to withstand forces that would liquefy most organic life forms. It was, in the proud words of the facility director, completely over-engineered for every conceivable scenario. The director had never met a human. Instructor Vexathor stood at the front of the mixed species evaluation class, his 4 eyes scanning the assembled students with the kind of weary patience that came from 2 decades of watching newcomers overestimate their capabilities. He was a Kravik, a species whose evolution had taken place on a world where predator and prey were less categories and more suggestions. Standing nearly 3 meters tall with musculature that looked like it had been sculpted by someone who fundamentally misunderstood the concept of subtlety. Vexathor was the Institute's first choice for physical assessment instruction. He'd seen it all, or so he believed. Physical evaluation, he began, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone who had given this speech roughly 8,000 times. is not about ego. It is not about proving yourself. It is about establishing realistic parameters for your safety and the safety of those around you. He gestured to the various pieces of equipment scattered around the facility. Weight resistance machines, gravitational simulators, impact absorption platforms. We have lost too many promising students to preventable injuries caused by overconfidence and inadequate self-assessment. The class consisted of 17 students from 14 different species. There were 2 Clendathi, their dense forms making them look like particularly athletic boulders. A Quilnarian sat in the back, her 6 arms folded in a way that suggested either deep contemplation or profound boredom. 3 Yriks clustered together, their insectoid bodies chittering softly as they communicated in their ultrasonic dialect. And there, sitting with a posture that could only be described as aggressively casual, was the human. She'd introduced herself at the beginning of the semester as Kira Chen, though she'd mentioned that humans often went by shortened versions of their names and that KC worked just fine. She was, by human standards, approximately average height, which put her somewhat below average by institute standards. Her build suggested regular physical activity, but nothing that would register as remarkable among species bred for strength. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical manner, brown eyes that seemed perpetually amused by some private joke, and the kind of relaxed confidence that made Vex Thor immediately suspicious. Humans had been attending the Institute for only 2 standard cycles, and in that time, they had developed a reputation for being enthusiastically reckless with their own physical well-being. They threw themselves into gravitational training at levels that should have crushed their skeletons. They volunteered for endurance courses designed for species with redundant cardiovascular system. They treated the medical facility's bone knitting department like a frequent customer rewards program. The Institute's insurance premiums had increased by 40% since humanity's arrival, and that was after implementing mandatory safety briefings that humans cheerfully ignored. Today, Vex Thor continued, you will demonstrate your baseline capabilities. This is not a competition. I want to see realistic assessments, proper form, and appropriate caution. We will begin with standard resistance exercises and progress according to each species' documented limitations. The next 30 minutes proceeded exactly according to protocol. The Clendathi students manipulated weights that would have pancaked most carbon-based life forms, their movements precise and controlled. The Quilnarian demonstrated her species' impressive upper body strength by performing one-armed suspension exercises that drew appreciative clicks from her classmates. Even the Yriks, despite their relatively modest size, showed off the impressive grip strength that came from evolution on a world of sheer cliffs and vertical forests. Kira watched all of this with the expression of someone waiting patiently for a particularly slow download to complete. When her turn came, Vex Thor approached with his evaluation tablet and what he considered his encouraging but realistic voice. Now, Miss Chen, I want you to understand that there is no shame in acknowledging physical limitations. Your species' preliminary assessments indicate that we're basically made of wet tissue paper and optimism? Kira interrupted, her tone cheerful. Yeah, I read the reports. They were hilarious. Vex Thor's mandibles twitched in what might have been irritation. The assessments are scientific and thorough. They indicate that humans possess minimal physical capability compared to the galactic standard. For your safety, I must insist that you... Let me guess, Kira said, standing up and stretching in a way that made several joints pop audibly. You want me to try lifting something appropriately lightweight, demonstrate that I understand my limitations, and accept my place among the galaxy's more delicate species. Precisely, Vex Thor said, relieved that this human at least seemed to understand the situation. Self-awareness is the first step toward, how about I lift something heavy instead? The classroom went quiet in the way that spaces do when everyone simultaneously realizes they're about to witness either something remarkable or a spectacular medical emergency. The Quilnarian's arms unfolded with interest. The Clendathi exchanged glances that suggested they were already calculating injury probabilities. Even the Yuriks stopped their chittering, their compound eyes focusing on the human with what might have been concern or morbid curiosity. Vexthor's expression cycled through several emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, concern, professional obligation, and a dawning sense that this was going to generate paperwork. Miss Chen, I cannot in good conscience allow you to attempt weights beyond your species' documented safe range. The liability alone. What if I sign a waiver? Kira asked, her grin widening. I'm pretty sure humans brought those with us. We bring them everywhere. They're like our cultural comfort object. This was unfortunately accurate. Humanity's integration package had included an entire subsection devoted to liability waivers, legal release forms, and what the Human Diplomatic Corps cheerfully referred to as hold harmless agreements for stupid ideas we're going to try anyway. The Institute's legal department had spent weeks trying to understand why a species would preemptively develop paperwork for their own poor decisions. Vexthor found himself in the peculiar position of having his own protocols used against him. The Institute did allow students to exceed recommended guidelines if proper waivers were filed and medical staff were present. It was a provision that existed mostly for overachieving Clendathi, who wanted to push their already impressive capabilities. It had never been intended for species at the other end of the strength spectrum. Very well, he said slowly, already composing the incident report in his head. What exactly did you have in mind? Kira turned and surveyed the class, her eyes scanning her fellow students with the methodical assessment of someone making a very specific type of calculation. Her gaze passed over the Yuriks. Too light. She considered the Quilnarian possible, but not particularly impressive. The Clendathi would work, but they'd done it to each other already as part of their cultural bonding exercises. Then her eyes landed on the back corner of the facility, where Torvin had been observing the proceedings with the kind of detached interest that came from being so far above the established hierarchy that the whole thing seemed faintly absurd. Torvin was a Vraxian, and Vraxians were what happened when evolution got drunk on its own power and decided to create the universe's most unnecessarily intimidating species. They stood, on average, 4 meters tall, with musculature that made Vexthor look like he'd skipped leg day for the past decade. Their homeworld was a nightmare of megafauna and hyper-aggressive ecosystems, the kind of place where the plants had evolved teeth and the weather patterns included aggressive as a standard forecast category. Vraxians were apex predators who had climbed to the top of their food chain by being better at violence than everything else on their planet. And they had the dentition to prove it. Torvin himself was considered average by Vraxian standards, which meant he was terrifying by everyone else's. His scales carried the deep, blue-black coloration of his northern clan, and his eyes, all 3 of them, held the kind of calm confidence that came from never having met a physical challenge that required actual effort. He weighed approximately 450 kilograms of dense muscle, reinforced bone structure, and what the Institute's biology department clinically described as excessive predatory optimization. Kira pointed directly at him. I'll lift him. The silence that followed this declaration had texture. It was the kind of silence that pressed against eardrums and made people question whether sound had ever actually existed or if it had all been a pleasant hallucination that had just ended. Vexthor's tablet slipped from his hands and clattered on the floor. the noise absurdly loud in the stillness. "You want to," he began, then stopped, attempting to reboot his translation matrices because surely he had misheard. "You want to lift Torvin?" "Yep," Kira said, her casual tone suggesting she'd just volunteered to help move furniture rather than proposing to deadlift a creature that could bite through hull plating. From the back of the facility, Torvin made a sound that might have been amusement or possibly indigestion. It was hard to tell with Vraxians. "The small one makes a joke," he rumbled, his voice carrying the kind of bass frequencies that you felt in your sternum rather than heard with your ears. "I appreciate human humor. It is very—" He paused, searching for the word. "Optimistic." "Not joking," Kira called back. "I mean, unless you're worried you're too heavy. I can try one of the Klendathi first if you need a confidence boost." Several students made choking sounds. The concept of a human offering a confidence boost to a Vraxian was so fundamentally backwards that it bordered on theological heresy. Torvin's scales rippled in a pattern that his species used to express either interest or pre-hunt excitement, emotions that, for Vraxians, were essentially the same thing. "You believe you can lift me," Torvin said, rising to his full height in a display that was probably meant to be intimidating, but came across more like a particularly large building deciding to stand up. "This is a fascinating claim." Vexthor was frantically scrolling through his tablet, trying to find the specific regulation that would prevent this catastrophe from occurring. Unfortunately, the Institute's protocols had been written by committees who had never imagined a scenario where a Category 4 minimal physical capability species would volunteer to lift a Vraxian. It simply wasn't in the threat assessment matrix. It was like trying to find the regulation preventing houseplants from challenging starships to races. "Miss Chen." Vexthor tried again, his voice taking on the pleading quality of someone watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. "I must strongly advise against this course of action. The physical disparity between your species and Torven's is— Yeah, he's pretty big." Kira agreed, walking toward the Vraxian with the kind of casual stride that suggested she was approaching a friendly dog rather than a creature that could theoretically eat her without requiring condiments. "That's kind of the point. If I'm going to demonstrate that your assessments are hilariously wrong, I might as well go big or go home, right?" The Quilnarian leaned toward one of the Klendathi students. "Should we summon medical staff?" she whispered. "Medical staff and possibly structural engineers," the Klendathi replied. "I want to see what happens to the floor when she fails and drops him." Torvin watched the approaching human with the three-eyed focus of a predator, observing something that was either prey or entertainment. Categories that for Vraxians had considerable overlap. "You understand," he said, his tone almost gentle, "that I weigh more than 4 of you combined? That my species' bone density alone—" "I know exactly how much you weigh," Kira interrupted, stopping in front of him and tilting her head back to maintain eye contact. "I checked the roster. 447 kilograms as of your last medical evaluation. You've probably gained a couple since then. You've been hitting the protein dispensers pretty hard." She paused, then grinned. "I've been watching." This admission caused another ripple of Torvin's scales, though this one seemed more like surprise than threat display. Vraxians weren't used to being observed. They were used to being the ones doing the observing, typically right before they did something unpleasant to whatever they were observing. "The human has been studying," Torvin said, and something that might have been respect entered his voice. "This is unexpected. Most species prefer to pretend Vraxians do not exist unless directly confronted with our presence. Most species didn't evolve lifting heavy things for fun, Kira replied. She began her warm-up routine, which consisted of movements that made the assembled aliens exchange confused glances. She rolled her shoulders, twisted her torso, did something complicated with her neck that produced concerning cracking sounds, and then dropped into a series of positions that seemed to involve squatting repeatedly while maintaining a posture that looked deeply uncomfortable. "What is she doing?" One of the Yuriks chittered to its companion. "I believe it is a pre-failure ritual," the other responded. "Many species have religious practices they perform before certain death." Vexthor had given up on finding regulatory relief and was now simply recording everything for the inevitable inquiry. His career was probably over, but at least the documentation would be thorough. He toggled his tablet to medical alert status, which would summon the facility's trauma team. They'd probably need them. They'd definitely need them. Kira finished her warm-up and turned to Torvin with the expression of someone about to attempt something either brilliant or catastrophically stupid. Categories that, for humans, had considerable overlap. "All right, here's how this is going to work. I'm going to need you to stand still and let me get positioned. This works best if you don't help or resist. Just be, a really big weight." "I am frequently described as such," Torvin said, and his tone suggested he might actually be enjoying this situation. Vraxians had a cultural appreciation for courage, even when that courage was indistinguishable from suicidal stupidity. "I will attempt to embody maximum heaviness." Kira circled him once, assessing angles and calculating leverage points with the focused intensity of a professional evaluating a complex problem. She muttered something under her breath that sounded like conventional versus sumo stance, then nodded to herself as if confirming an internal decision. She positioned herself directly in front of Torvin, squared her stance, and reached down to grip his lower torso just above where his legs connected to his main body mass. "This is the point," the Quilnarian whispered, "where she realizes her mistake and hopefully releases him before attempting the actual lift." But Kira didn't release. Instead, she adjusted her grip, set her feet in a position that was wider than her shoulders, dropped her hips in a way that made several students wince, took a deep breath that seemed to fill her entire torso. And then, nothing happened. For a moment that stretched into awkward eternity, Kira remained locked in position, her muscles tensed, her face displaying the kind of focused concentration usually reserved for disarming explosives or declaring war. Torvin remained exactly where he was, which was standing on the ground, being heavy. The laws of physics continued to operate as expected. The universe maintained its sense of order. Vexthor felt a wave of relief wash over him. The human had tried, failed, and hopefully learned a valuable lesson about the importance of realistic self-assessment. This could still end without a major incident. He could salvage his career. Everything was going to be. Kira adjusted her grip slightly, reset her breathing, engaged what appeared to be her entire posterior muscle chain in a movement that started from her legs and transferred through her core and lifted. Torvin rose off the ground. Not slowly, not with the struggling, shaking effort of someone at the absolute limit of their capability. With the smooth, controlled power of someone who had done this before and knew exactly what they were doing. Kira's legs straightened. Her back maintained its rigid position, her arms locked in position, and 450 kilograms of apex predator found itself suddenly experiencing a perspective it had never encountered before. Being lifted by something smaller than itself. The sound that filled Training Complex Gamma 7 was the collective intake of breath from 17 students, one instructor, and possibly the facility's environmental systems experiencing sympathetic shock. It was the sound of fundamental assumptions being violently renegotiated. It was the sound of the universe casually mentioning that everything you thought you knew was adorably wrong. Kira held Torvin at full extension for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough to make it clear this wasn't a fluke, wasn't momentum, wasn't some trick of leverage or technique that had momentarily defeated physics. Then, she lowered him with the same controlled precision, set him back on the ground, released her grip, and stood up with a satisfied nod. "There we go," she said, her breathing elevated but not labored. "New personal record. Thanks for that." Torvin stood very still, all 3 eyes wide in an expression that Vraxian behavioral specialists would later describe as profound existential recalibration. He looked down at his feet, as if confirming they were back on solid ground. He looked at his hands, as if checking whether they still worked. He looked at Kira, who was now casually stretching her lower back with the air of someone who had just completed a routine task. "I was in the air," Torvin said slowly, his voice carrying the tone of someone working through a complex mathematical proof. "The human put me in the air. Technically, I lifted you approximately 30 centimeters. Kira corrected. Full overhead would require a different technique, and honestly, the ceiling's not high enough for that anyway." The classroom erupted. The Klendathi were making sounds that their species used to express confusion so profound it bordered on philosophical crisis. The Quilnarian had all 6 arms in the air, gesticulating wildly while attempting to recalculate everything she knew about comparative physiology. The Yuriks had abandoned their ultrasonic dialect entirely and were simply buzzing loudly in what might have been their equivalent of screaming. 3 students in the back were urgently checking their translation matrices, convinced that they must have misunderstood what lift meant in Standard Galactic Common. Vexthor's tablet had stopped recording, not because he'd turned it off, but because the device's analysis algorithms had encountered data so far outside their operational parameters that they'd simply given up. The instructor stood frozen, his 4 eyes locked on the human, his mandibles working soundlessly as his brain attempted to process what had just occurred. "That's not possible," he finally managed. "The biomechanical analysis, the preliminary assessments, the entire physical evaluation framework." "Yeah, about that," Kira said, rolling her shoulders again in a way that suggested she could probably do a few more reps if anyone was interested. "You guys made a pretty fundamental error in your human assessment. You looked at our gravity, saw it was standard, looked at our muscle structure, saw it was adequate, and assumed that meant we were weak." She grinned, and there was something distinctly predatory in the expression. "You forgot to ask what we used all that muscle for." One of the Klendathi found his voice. "Your planet has standard gravity. Your environment is not extreme. What possible evolutionary pressure would develop such disproportionate strength?" "Oh, you know," Kira said with affected casualness. "Throwing things at animals that wanted to eat us, carrying dead animals back to our homes after we killed them, lifting heavy objects to build shelters, move obstacles, construct tools, persistence hunting, where we'd chase prey for hours until they literally collapsed from exhaustion while we just kept going." She paused. "Also, some of us thought it was fun to see who could lift the heaviest things, so we just kept doing it. Made a sport out of it, multiple sports, actually." The Quilnarian's arms had slowly lowered as she processed this information. You developed strength capabilities far beyond environmental necessity because some members of your species found it entertaining? I mean, when you say it like that, it sounds weird, Kira admitted. But yeah, basically. Humans have been competitively lifting heavy things for thousands of our years. We invented special equipment just to lift heavier things. We developed entire nutritional sciences around building stronger muscles. We created training methodologies, wrote books, established records. She gestured at Torvin, who was still standing very still and looking slightly traumatized. Where I come from, there are humans who could lift him overhead, like press him, multiple times. This declaration broke something fundamental in the classroom's collective understanding of reality. Multiple times. Overhead. The math didn't math. The physics fizzed in entirely wrong directions. The universe had clearly filed the paperwork incorrectly. Torvin finally shook himself out of his stunned state, his scales rippling in a pattern that Vraxian specialists would later identify as a profound respect mixed with healthy fear. Your species hunted for sport, he said slowly. You built strength beyond necessity. You turned survival capability into recreational activity. His three eyes focused on Kira with new intensity. You are predators. We're persistence predators, Kira corrected. We're not fast. We're not particularly strong compared to the things we hunted, and we don't have natural weapons. But we're absolutely relentless. We can outlast almost anything, and we developed enough intelligence to make up for every physical disadvantage with tools, strategy, and sheer stubborn refusal to quit. She smiled. Also, we domesticated wolves, which were basically your species' equivalent on Earth, and we turned them into pets that we breed to be cute and fluffy. The Yurix made a sound that might have been their equivalent of a laugh or possibly a nervous breakdown. Your species domesticated apex predators, one managed, for companionship and hunting assistance, Kira added helpfully, and guarding and rescue work, and showing in competitions where we judge them on appearance and obedience. We've been doing it for so long that we have hundreds of breeds, each designed for different purposes, and some of them are small enough to carry in bags. Vexthor had managed to reboot his higher cognitive functions and was now frantically scrolling through Earth's biological database on his tablet. What he found there made his mandibles click in distress. Humans hadn't just survived their planet's ecosystem. They dominated it so thoroughly that they'd driven multiple species to extinction, domesticated others, and then developed ethical frameworks to protect the species they'd previously been hunting because they felt bad about it. Their planet's megafauna had largely disappeared after human expansion, and the prevailing theory was that humans had simply eaten them all. The Category 4 classification, Vexthor said weakly, was based on preliminary remote analysis. We assessed your home world's gravity, analyzed sample tissue provided by your diplomatic corps, and calculated expected parameters based on comparable species. He looked at his tablet as if it had personally betrayed him. We never asked you to demonstrate. Yeah, that was your first mistake, Kira agreed. Humans are really good at looking harmless right up until we're not. It's kind of our thing. We're pursuit predators. We're designed to look unimpressive, so prey doesn't run immediately, and then we just keep coming until they collapse. She stretched again, several joints popping in sequence. Also, you analyzed tissue samples from our diplomatic corps, who are literally selected for being non-threatening. That's like assessing a Vraxian's combat potential by examining their poetry students. Your species has poetry students? Torvin asked, momentarily distracted. Of course we do. We have students for everything. We're really into learning random things, including things that have no practical survival application whatsoever. It's one of our most dangerous traits, actually. We learn constantly about everything, for no reason except that we find it interesting. The Quilnarian had pulled out her own data pad and was now furiously cross-referencing human physiological data with known species parameters. Your skeletal structure is reinforced beyond what should be necessary for your gravity level, she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone solving a mystery while simultaneously being horrified by the solution. Your muscle fiber density is comparable to species from high-gravity worlds. Your cardiovascular efficiency is rated for endurance that exceeds most mammalian species by orders of magnitude. She looked up, all 6 eyes wide. You're built like a pursuit predator from a death world. Earth's not technically classified as a death world, Kira said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced of this classification's accuracy. It's more like a moderately aggressive world, with weather, and a lot of things that want to kill you, and natural disasters, and diseases, and parasites. She paused thoughtfully. Okay, yeah, maybe it's a bit of a death world. One of the Klendathi was still staring at the spot where Torvin had been lifted, as if he could rewind reality by looking at it hard enough. But the math, he said helplessly. The biomechanical analysis shows that your leverage disadvantage alone should make lifting a Vraxian impossible. Your muscle attachment points, your joint angles, your center of mass. Yeah, those calculations are all wrong because you didn't account for technique, Kira interrupted. Humans have been lifting heavy things for so long that we've optimized every aspect of it. We've mapped every muscle fiber, calculated optimal angles, developed training programs that maximize strength-to-weight ratios. That lift I just did, it's called a deadlift, and humans have been refining the technique for centuries. We have competitions where people lift 3 times their body weight. Some of our strongest lifters move masses that would crush most species just from attempting. Vexathor was rapidly cycling through what could only be described as the 7 stages of bureaucratic grief. The entire human integration program, he said slowly, has been designed around the assumption that your species requires protective accommodation due to physical fragility. We've installed assistance technology, implemented safety protocols, limited your access to heavy equipment. Which is hilarious, Kira said, laughing. Because the first thing humans did when we got here was figure out how to disable all the safety locks and recalibrate the equipment to proper settings. Did you really think we wouldn't notice that the standard weights in the facility were like 30% of what they should be? You've been training with improperly calibrated equipment. Vexthor's voice had risen to a pitch that suggested his species' equivalent of panic. For 2 standard cycles? Well, yeah. We thought you just had really generous weight markings. Like maybe it was a cultural thing, the way some human gyms have plates that aren't actually as heavy as they claim to boost people's egos. Kira grinned. We've been supplementing with creative solutions. There's a human in the engineering track who's been deadlifting cargo containers for fun. The classroom had descended into the kind of chaos that occurs when fundamental truths are revealed to be comprehensive lies. Students were arguing, recalculating, accessing databases, and generally experiencing the academic equivalent of existential crisis. Several were looking at Kira with expressions that ranged from awe to terror, to the beginning of what might have been crush-level admiration. Torvin had recovered enough of his composure to approach Kira again, though he maintained a respectful distance that suggested he was newly aware of his own liftability. I must know, he said, his voice carrying genuine curiosity beneath its usual predatory rumble. If you can lift me, what is the maximum your species can lift? Kira considered this. Well, the current human deadlift record is held by a guy who lifted about 500 kilograms. That's in standard Earth gravity, following competition rules, with proper technique verification. But humans have moved heavier loads using different methods. Strongman competitors have lifted cars, pulled aircraft, carried boulders that mass close to 300 kilos over distance. She smiled. And that's just the competitive athletes. Regular humans who train for strength can manage pretty impressive numbers. I'm solidly intermediate by Earth standards. Intermediate, the Quilnarian repeated faintly. You lifted a Vraxian and you're intermediate. I mean, I'm not competing at elite levels or anything. I just really enjoy lifting heavy things. It's meditative. Kira noticed the expressions around her and added, "What?" "It is. There's something really satisfying about picking up something heavy and then putting it back down. Very simple, very direct. No ambiguity about whether you succeeded." Vexthor had reached the final stage of bureaucratic grief, which was acceptance mixed with resignation and topped with the certainty of extensive paperwork. "I will need to submit a comprehensive revision to the Human Physical Capability Assessment," he said, his voice hollow. "This will require extensive documentation. You're going to have to reclassify every human at the Institute," the Klendathi pointed out. "Recalibrate all the equipment, revise the safety protocols, update the facility access permissions. Revise the entire integration program," the Quilnarian added. "The implications for human-alien interaction protocols alone. Probably update insurance premiums," one of the Yuriks chimed in helpfully. "Significantly." Vexthor made a sound that might have been laughter or weeping or possibly both simultaneously. His career wasn't ending. It was transforming into something entirely different and far more complicated. He looked at Kira, who was now casually chatting with Torvin about optimal grip positioning and the relative merits of different lifting styles, and felt the weight of 2 years of comprehensively wrong assumptions settling on his shoulders. "Miss Chen," he said, and his voice carried the particular quality of someone who had just had their entire worldview bench-pressed and then dropped on their head. "I believe I owe you an apology. The preliminary assessment of your species was incomplete." "Hey, no worries," Kira said with genuine warmth. "Everyone makes mistakes. You guys just made a really funny one that resulted in an entire sapient species being classified as delicate flower people, when we're actually persistence-hunting gym enthusiasts who domesticated wolves and invented pizza." She paused. "You know what? That's a pretty good summary of humanity right there. We're either going to befriend you or outlast you, and either way, we're bringing snacks." The class eventually resumed, though resumed was perhaps too generous a term for what was essentially supervised chaos as every student attempted to recalibrate their understanding of human capabilities. The Klendathi insisted on measuring Kira's grip strength, which turned out to be embarrassingly impressive. The Yuriks wanted to calculate her power-to-weight ratio, which required mathematics that made their translators smoke slightly. Even the typically reserved members of other species found themselves drawn to the human, asking questions about training methods, nutritional requirements, and whether it was true that humans sometimes lifted heavy things while listening to aggressive music for motivational purposes. Torvin, for his part, had developed what could only be described as professional respect mixed with the wariness of a predator who had just discovered that prey might be a relative term. He spent the rest of the session observing Kira with the focus of someone cataloging a potential threat, though his scales occasionally rippled in patterns that suggested he was also deeply entertained by the whole situation. As the session ended and students began filing out, Vexthor found himself standing next to Kira as she gathered her belongings. A process that included a water container sized for someone 3 times her mass, and what appeared to be a nutrient bar that smelled like concentrated protein and existential defiance. "I have been teaching physical assessment for 20 standard cycles," Vexthor said quietly. "I have evaluated hundreds of species, processed thousands of students, and I believed I understood the fundamental principles of biomechanical capability." He looked at the human, this small, unassuming creature that had just casually violated every assumption he'd held. "In a single afternoon, you have demonstrated that I understood nothing." Kira smiled, and there was kindness in the expression despite its predatory edge. "You understood plenty. You just didn't account for the fact that some species are really, really stubborn about getting stronger for no practical reason except that it makes us feel accomplished." She hefted her bag, which probably massed more than most students' entire kit. "Earth didn't make us strong because we needed to be strong. We made ourselves strong because we decided it was worth doing." That's pretty human, honestly. We're not the fastest, strongest, or smartest species in our own ecosystem. But we're the ones who decided that every limitation was just a challenge we hadn't solved yet. As Kira left the facility, Vexthor watched her go and contemplated the comprehensive revision reports he would need to file. The entire human integration program would need restructuring. Safety protocols would need recalibration. Equipment would need adjustment. Insurance actuaries would need therapy. But more than that, the Institute would need to fundamentally reconsider what it meant when a species from a standard gravity world with unremarkable biology submitted integration paperwork. Because sometimes, Vexthor was beginning to understand, the most dangerous capabilities weren't the ones evolution provided. They were the ones a species decided to develop themselves, for no reason beyond the satisfaction of proving they could. Somewhere in the facility, a human engineering student was apparently deadlifting cargo containers for fun. Somewhere else, human medical students were probably running endurance courses designed for species with multiple hearts. Throughout the Institute, humans were quietly ignoring safety limitations, recalibrating equipment, and generally demonstrating that the phrase "physically incapable" was less a statement of fact and more a personal challenge. The galaxy, Vexthor reflected, had no idea what it had invited to join it. Humanity had arrived with diplomatic credentials, integration paperwork, and comprehensive safety waivers. What they'd failed to mention was that they were a species of persistence predators who had gotten bored with surviving their death world and decided to make recreational competition out of every physical activity they'd originally developed for hunting and combat. The Institute's preliminary assessment had classified humans as Category 4 minimal physical capability, suitable for academic and light administrative work, requiring extensive physical accommodation and protective protocols. They were going to need to revise that classification significantly, probably all the way up to whatever category included capable of casually lifting apex predators while explaining the cultural history of competitive weightlifting. Vexthor looked at his tablet, opened a new incident report, stared at the blank form for a long moment, and then simply wrote, "Comprehensive reassessment required. Human capabilities vastly exceed preliminary analysis. Send help, and possibly heavier equipment. They're going to want heavier equipment." He submitted the report and wondered, not for the first time that day, whether the galaxy had been better off before it learned that humans considered physical limitations to be suggestions rather than facts. Probably not, he decided. But it had certainly been less complicated. And somewhere in Training Complex Gamma 7, the equipment groaned under loads it was never designed to handle, because humans had arrived and decided that maximum capacity was just another phrase for starting weight. The universe, in its infinite wisdom, had given humanity a standard gravity world and adequate musculature. Humanity had taken one look at these completely reasonable evolutionary gifts and said, "Neat. Now watch this." The rest of the galaxy was still processing the implications.